So in my talk this afternoon, I'm going to talk about psychological attachments. The title of the talk is Freedom from Attachment. And we're going to talk about, well, first of all, what are psychological attachments? How do they affect us? And how can we free ourselves from them? But basically what I mean by a psychological attachment is anything external that we depend on for our well-being. So in some cases it's something very hard and physical, like an addiction. It could be an addiction to alcohol, to chocolate, to drugs, and so on. That's a very hard, obvious kind of attachment. But in many cases, attachments are more subtle and they're psychological rather than physical. So an attachment is sometimes an attachment to ambitions. It could be an attachment to the future in general, which could mean that you're living your life in terms of the future rather than in the present because you're so focused on your ambitions and goals for the future. Or it could be an attachment to the past, where you're so attached to the past that you're living in terms of your memory. Maybe you're filled with resentments about the past. You're filled with a sense of failure because of what's happened in your past. And it could be a sense of bitterness towards people who've done bad things to you in the past. So you're attached to those things in the past. Or it could be an attachment to possessions. You know, if you're a kind of materialistic person who gathers possessions, who likes to collect money, to accumulate money, that's another kind of attachment. Or an attachment to success. Maybe you feel that you're a successful person, you've achieved quite a few significant things in this life, and you feel proud of yourself. You have an attachment to the achievements you've had and the accomplishments and success you've built up. So all of these things, all of these attachments, they give us a sense of identity. You feel that you are somebody because of your ambitions, because of your beliefs, because of your achievements, because of your possessions. So in a very subtle way, they reinforce your sense of identity. And, you know, in some ways, attachments, you know, they make us feel important. You know, they make us feel that we are significant people living important lives. They make us feel proud. They build up our self-esteem. But ultimately, they have a very negative effect because they cover up our essential self. I think of attachments as building blocks of the ego. Every attachment is a building block which creates your sense of identity, and every time you build up your ego, you lose connection with your essential self. And I found in my research as a psychologist, as Mike said, I've done many research studies of people who undergo spiritual awakening, and I found that there are 3 ways in which spiritual awakening can occur. I've had a walkout already. Leo, 5-year-old Leo, has walked out already. That's a bad sign. I've always wanted to appeal to children as a spiritual psychologist. Maybe he'll come back later. Is he? Oh, he's listening outside, that's fine. My ego has recovered from the blow. As I was saying, there are 3 ways in which spiritual awakening occurs, as I found from my research. The first way is when it's natural, when somebody just is naturally spiritually awakened. And, you know, these people, they often don't become spiritual teachers or spiritual authors. They're more likely to become poets or painters. Sometimes they become social activists because they feel a very strong altruistic connection to other human beings. They want to improve the lives of other people. But they're people who, they don't undergo a sudden spiritual awakening. They don't sit through years of meditation in order to become spiritually awakened. They just are. They were born spiritually awakened. Or maybe the most accurate way to put it is that, you know, I think there are some parallels between the childhood state, especially the young childhood state, and spiritual awakening. I'm not saying that young children are enlightened. And if any of you have young children, you probably know that they're not enlightened. But there are certain elements of the youthful childhood state which are paralleled in spiritual awakening, like a sense of presence, living in the moment, and also a lack of separateness, a sense that you are one with your experience, that you are connected to the world. So I think maybe what happens is that some people don't lose their natural childhood wakefulness. I think most adults tend to lose it as we become adults, but maybe some people just retain it And maybe it actually becomes stronger as they become adults. So these are naturally spiritually awakened people. And the second way in which spiritual awakening can happen is when it's gradual as a result of spiritual practice. So there are millions of people in the world, there are thousands of people on the Isle of Man. I think the population of the Isle of Man is 80,000. Is that right? So out of those 80,000 people on the Isle of Man, how many do you think are engaged in some kind of spiritual practice like yoga, tai chi, meditation? Maybe 10,000? 5,000? Quite a few. So I think that's a microcosm of the whole world. I think there are so many people in the whole world who are following some kind of spiritual practice, whether it's meditation or yoga or the path of the Buddha or Taoism or the Kabbalah, many different forms of spiritual practice and spiritual paths. So if you follow a spiritual practice or path for years or decades, then it's inevitable that you will undergo some degree of spiritual awakening. Your being will slowly open in a more expansive way to the whole world. You'll become more connected to other human beings. You'll become more connected to a deeper sense of self within you. And that's what I call spiritual awakening. And it happens gradually through those spiritual practices. And the third way in which people undergo spiritual awakening is when it happens suddenly and dramatically, without warning, in a millisecond. It can happen in a millisecond, a sudden instant. And when it happens suddenly and dramatically, it's usually the result of intense psychological turmoil. So it could be a long spell of depression, it could be a long spell of addiction, it could be divorce, bereavement, a diagnosis of cancer. And it's not uncommon. I found in my research that there are so many cases of spiritual awakening happening very suddenly in the midst of this psychological turmoil. Almost every week somebody writes to me after reading one of my books to say that they've had a similar spiritual awakening. And often the people who have this experience, they have no background in spirituality, they know nothing about meditation or Buddhism. They're just ordinary people, seemingly ordinary people, living a normal everyday life. But through a long period of suffering and psychological turmoil, something breaks down inside them, something shifts inside them, and it reaches the point where something suddenly opens in a very dramatic way, almost like a phoenix rising from the ashes, or what's another metaphor I could use, like a chrysalis, like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, this sudden opening, this sudden transformation. And the transformation is so sudden that people often feel like they're a completely new person. One person said to me that they felt they were like a different person living in the same body. This was a person called Nicola, who went through, I think it started with the death of her mother. It began with a bereavement. Then she became seriously ill for a while, for several months, to the point where she was housebound and couldn't function anymore. And suddenly at the end of this long process of suffering, something shifted inside her, and she felt that she was a new person. Her consciousness suddenly opened and became more expansive and more intense. And she said, as I mentioned, that she felt like a new person living in the same body. And when she went back to her hometown, and people said to her, "Oh, hi Nicola, how you doing? What have you been up to?" She was like, "Oh, who are they talking to?" She was actually surprised that people were recognizing her and talking to her, because she felt so different inside. She felt like a new person, and she couldn't understand that they still knew her. So the big question I wanted to answer in my research is, why does this sudden spiritual awakening occur in the midst of intense psychological turmoil? I'm leaving a long pause now just to build up the drama before I answer the question. Actually, I'm not going to answer it right now. I'll answer it in a short while. I'd like to just illustrate the phenomenon I've been describing by asking you a question about your own lives. So the question I'm going to ask you is, Have you ever had a very negative experience, a terrible experience in your life, a painful experience, which could involve depression, stress, or psychological turmoil? Have you had an experience like that, which despite the trauma and pain of it, in the long run, you feel that it had a powerful positive effect, it helped you to grow in some way? Has anybody had that experience? Oh, hands up if you've had that experience. Yeah, it's a very common human experience. The phenomenon where we develop in a positive way, we grow through turmoil and suffering and hardship. And in mainstream psychology, and I'm partly involved in mainstream psychology through my job at my university as a lecturer and researcher. In mainstream psychology, it's called post-traumatic growth. Anybody heard that term before? Post-traumatic growth? And it's a very common and well-researched concept. Over the last 20 years, it's become known as one of the most sort of significant concepts in psychology. And it's simply, as the term suggests, it's the process of growing through undergoing hardship and suffering. And post-traumatic growth happens no matter what the source of the trauma is. So it could be divorce, bereavement, unemployment, even extreme forms of hardship and suffering such as torture have been known to produce post-traumatic growth. A couple of years ago at my university, we did a research project on refugees who live in Leeds, which is where I'm based. And we wanted to find out if there were any cases of post-traumatic growth in refugees and asylum seekers. And we found 3 or 4 really extreme cases of post-traumatic growth. There was one lady who, she was Nigerian, and her relatives had been killed by Boko Haram, I think it is, the terrorist group in Nigeria. So her husband had been killed, her father had been seriously injured, and she'd witnessed the deaths of some members of her family because the terrorists attacked her compound. So she went through extreme suffering, witnessing of the deaths of members of her family. She was also tortured. But she's probably one of the most positive and enlightened people I've met. And her view is that, we interviewed her about her experiences, and she said that after going through so much suffering, so much pain, and surviving that pain and suffering, she felt that she was unbreakable. She felt that now nothing could touch her. She was almost indestructible. And she said she felt like a lioness, like roaring with her strength and resilience. And her main aim now is to help other refugees in England in the same situation, to support other refugees, to help them to come through the pain of their experiences, to experience growth in the way that she had. So post-traumatic growth is very common in any situation where trauma occurs, even in disasters. Like one of the first studies of post-traumatic growth was the Zeebrugge ferry disaster in 1987, I think it was, when about 200 people died on the ferry to Belgium and 200 people survived. But the researchers found that 200 people, of those 200 people who survived, around half of them experienced positive after effects. They felt more grateful for life. They felt more grateful for the people around them in their lives. They felt more appreciative of just being alive in the world. And they had a deeper sense of perspective where silly, trivial things didn't bother them so much anymore. And those are typical characteristics of post-traumatic growth. And there's another phenomenon which I've experienced quite a few times in my life, and maybe you've experienced it too. I've experienced it in my life several times when situations have occurred which have seemed to break me down. When I've lost things that I depended on for my happiness. I'll give you one example. When I was 28 years old, at that time I was a musician, playing in a band, and I'd been living in Germany as a musician. But in a short period of time, everything seemed to break down. Like my band broke up, and I'd been unsuccessful for so long as a musician. I thought, well, that's it now. I can't be bothered anymore. I'm just going to let go of my ambitions to be a successful musician. I'd had so many knockbacks. And also, my relationship with my girlfriend broke up. I'd been together with a girl for 4 years, and the relationship broke up in quite a traumatic way. And I also lost my job, so things were not going particularly well. And I decided to give up my life in Germany. There was nothing in Germany for me anymore. I'd lost my friends, my girlfriend, my band, my job. I thought I'm just going to go back to England. So I went back to live at my parents' house. I knocked on my parents' door and said, "Hi, I'm back. Can I live with you again?" And they said, "Okay then, if you've got nowhere else to go." but it's not really a sign of success when you go back to your parents' house at the age of 28 and ask them if you can live with them again. So I felt that I'd failed. I felt that everything had broken down. I felt in some way that I'd been reduced to nothing. All my hopes had been dashed. All my ambitions had collapsed. My relationship had broken up, and so on. And I felt like I had to begin again from scratch. I had to sort of rebuild my life and find out who I was again. And I felt really depressed. I felt really devastated and depressed, really knocked down and beaten down by life. But at the same time, there was a little voice inside my head which said, it seemed to be saying, "Don't worry." This little part of me seemed to be smiling somehow. Deep inside me, there was this little smile that seemed to say, "Don't worry, it's going to be fine." So I didn't give in completely to my depression because I had this sense, this deep sense somehow that things were going to work out. And that was actually in some ways the beginning of my life. I began to connect with something more authentic inside me. I began to live in a way which was rooted within my authentic self. And I began to feel a sense of contentment. Once I'd begun to rebuild my life, I felt a new sense of contentment which had never been there before. And, in some ways, that is when my spiritual life began. I started to meditate, became a vegetarian, gave up smoking, almost gave up drinking, but not completely. But yeah, I really began to live in a way which was attuned to my deeper self. So I felt that in some way, all of the disappointments and losses I experienced somehow cleared away a lot of debris so that I could begin to live in an authentic way. I'd just like to read a poem which I wrote about this experience. I also write kind of spiritual poetry. And last year I read 2 or 3 of my poems, so I'd like to read this one. It's called "The Smile." And see if you can recognize this experience in your own lives. Maybe you've had a similar experience. The smile. At the moment of brutal disappointment, when you realize that your hopes were illusions, and you're ashamed of your gullibility, and angry with the world for stringing you along, for letting this foolish game go on so long. And your future seems bleak and stark, without those filters of delusion. And you survey the wreckage of your life, wondering if you were ever who you thought you were. But maybe you can sense a part of you that's not a part of this. A part of you that stands outside this psychic storm, untouched by the chaos. Peering through the rubble and the clouds of dust, looking on and smiling. Knowing that this damage is only superficial. Just your facade, not your foundation. And that when the debris is cleared away, there will be more space inside for your essence to shine through. There's a famous saying which is normally attributed to Rumi, the Persian poet. You heard of Rumi, the Persian poet? He is, I don't think this is actually written down in these words anywhere, but these words are normally associated with Rumi. And the saying goes that when your ego weeps for what it has lost, your soul rejoices for what it has gained. And I think that's what's happening in these experiences. The ego feels the pain because it's lost its attachments, it's lost its sense of identity. But something deeper, you could call it the soul, feels a sense of liberation because it can express itself more fully. because these attachments have faded away. So this brings us back to the topic of psychological attachments. Because what I think happens when we go through trauma and pain and suffering in our lives, and then suddenly we undergo a spiritual awakening, suddenly something new emerges inside us, a sense of liberation, a sense of joy, a deep sense of oneness with ourselves. I think what happens in these moments is that all of our psychological attachments break down. Often when we go through a long period of illness or addiction or bereavement, the things we depend on for our identity and well-being are taken away. And one of the best examples I've researched in connection with this was a guy called Kevin. And Kevin was an alcoholic. Actually, at the time I got to know him, he was a counsellor at a university where I was teaching. He'd retrained as a counsellor. But 15 years prior to that, he'd been a functioning alcoholic. He was professionally an architect, quite a successful person with his own company. But as his drinking became more severe, he began to lose control of himself and of his life. So slowly, everything began to break down. His wife left him and took the kids with her, so he lost his family. And the people he used to work with no longer trusted him. He began to lose his business contacts because he was drunk and they no longer trusted him. And eventually his company collapsed and he had very severe debts. So everything he depended on for his identity and his well-being was taken away from him. His family, his job, his possessions, his sense of status, and so on. So he decided to commit suicide. He decided he had about £200 left in his bank account. He decided he was going to spend that £200 on bottles of whiskey, as many bottles of whiskey as he could buy for £200. He was just going to drink himself to death. That was his intention. But then he remembered that his father had been interested in psychic phenomena. His father used to go to psychic sessions with mediums. So he thought, oh, hold on. What if this isn't the end? What if there's another life after this one? I'm assuming that if I commit suicide, it will be the end, but maybe it's not. So he thought, oh crap, maybe suicide isn't the answer. And luckily, the next day, he was in a telephone box, and he saw a little card with the address of an AA meeting on it, and the telephone number. So he phoned the telephone number, and he went along to the meeting that afternoon. And he gained something from it straight away. So for 2 or 3 times a day over the next couple of weeks, he went to AA meetings and no longer drank. And there's a point in the AA process where you hand over your problem, when you say, this is too big for me to deal with, I'm going to hand it over to something bigger, whether you call it God or a higher power. So Kevin didn't believe in God, but he could understand the idea that there was something bigger, something more. So he said to himself, I can't deal with this, I'm just going to hand it over. So whatever's out there, whatever there is that's bigger than me, I'm going to hand it over to you. It's your problem now to deal with. And as soon as he did that, he felt a tremendous sense of liberation. He felt that something shifted inside him, almost as if something had opened up inside him, like a deep well of happiness that he'd never experienced before. Suddenly opened up and began to flow through him. This feeling of ease and bliss filled every fibre of his being. And also the desire to drink suddenly faded away. And like a lot of people who undergo this experience, he thought it was just temporary. He assumed it would fade away after a few days. But it became normal to him. Actually, let me just read Kevin's words. This is how, in my interviews with him, this is how he described the aftermath of this shift he went through. He said, I felt like I was on honeymoon. I didn't have a trouble in the world. I owned nothing. I was happy to own nothing. It's an understanding that there's something working on a higher level. It's a knowing that we don't have anything to worry about. And that feeling has remained with him ever since. I met him a couple of years ago, and he was still the same. He just radiates this powerful contentment. And now he works as a counsellor and a therapist. And, you know, he's a really good example of how losing everything can lead to a sudden spiritual awakening. And it sometimes happens in cases of cancer as well. I've met many people who were diagnosed with cancer and told that they only had a few months or something similar left to live. And in the midst of that terrible news and the devastation of realizing they were seriously ill, that their life was potentially threatened, they underwent this shift. A good example was a woman called Irene, who in 2003 she was diagnosed with cancer. And straight away, she began to look at the world in a different way. Almost as soon as she was diagnosed, she began to look at the world in a different way. Let me just describe how she reported her experience after being diagnosed with cancer. She said, "It was almost instantaneous overnight. It was the first time I'd seen death as a reality and realized that life was just temporary. The following day, I woke up and thought, I'm just so lucky to be alive. Although it was raining, it was just wonderful. The air was so clean and fresh, and everything I looked at seemed so vibrant and vivid. The trees were so green and everything was so alive. I was just seeing the energy of things." And like Kevin, she expected that the feeling would die away, but it remained inside her. It slightly de-intensified, but it remained as a normal state of being. So she said, "The feeling was really intense for the first few weeks, and it's remained ever since. It just blew me away, it really did. I used to just sit and think, this is amazing, that things could fall into place so quickly." So if you're diagnosed with an illness like cancer, if you're told that you may be going to die in a few months, then again it puts you into a state of detachment. You have to let go of your attachments. Facing death is a very powerful way of letting go of attachments. The future no longer exists. All of your success, all of your possessions, all of your achievements, they no longer have any significance. So you let go of these things, and in the process, you may undergo a sudden spiritual awakening. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, some people undergo this shift and some people don't. And why? Is there a difference in the people that do undergo this shift and the people that don't? Because you're right, I know people who've been diagnosed with cancer who seem to have gone the opposite way. They become more anxious. Instead of enabling them to transcend the ego, it seems to make the ego stronger. Yeah, that's true. And it's a very good question, because every human being goes through intense psychological turmoil at some point, but only a minority of people undergo this shift. A lot of people undergo post-traumatic growth, but this shift is a bit more intense. So yeah, the answer is, well, one of the answers is that it's connected with acceptance. A lot of people, when they face a difficult circumstance, when they face illness or bereavement, they don't really accept it. They try to resist it. They fight against it. But there's a certain attitude where you let go of your resistance, when you open yourself, you surrender to your situation. Just like Kevin, where he handed over his problem, you surrender to the situation. That act of acceptance or letting go seems to open up the transformational potential of these experiences. So that's one of the answers. I think there's also certain personality types. Like Kevin, who I talked about, he went on to work at Christie's Hospital as a therapist. And he said that you could always tell which people were going to undergo some kind of transformation and which people were going to get more bitter and more depressed. They said it tended to be the people who had like controlling personalities, the people who felt powerful. And he said, as a head teachers, apologies if anybody's a head teacher, but often people in very high level status positions with that kind of controlling personality. Obviously not everybody in those positions, I'm apologising here in case anybody is in those positions, but obviously not everybody in those positions has that kind of controlling personality, but obviously some people do. No, they didn't, because somehow that having that kind of personality, that controlling, that strong ego, seems to block the transformational potential. Yeah, obviously you can try to encourage them to accept their predicament. Yeah, then that's what Kevin was trying to do as a therapist. He was trying to unlock the transformational potential. So I'm going to get a little bit morbid now. There's nothing wrong with being morbid, is there? Death is a taboo subject, but why should it be taboo? Have you heard about death cafes? Anybody heard about death cafes? No? You sound like you don't want to hear about death cafes. No, death cafes, they've become quite popular in London and big cities like London, Manchester, Edinburgh. And they're basically, people hire out a cafe for the evening and they get together to talk about death. They just talk about how they feel about the idea of their demise. They talk about whether they believe in life after death, and how they've experienced the death of other people close to them. And people find it very liberating to talk about death in a kind of open, encouraging setting, in a situation where it's no longer considered taboo. And I do think that facing up to the concept of our own mortality can be quite a powerful tool of transformation. Mainly because, as I mentioned, it makes us detached from the external things we depend on for our identity and our well-being. So I'm going to ask you a question in a moment. But first of all, I've got some bad news. What's the date today? The 29th of June, 2019? Well, the bad news is that on the 29th of June, 2020, exactly 1 year from now, we're going to die. Oh, I'm sorry about that. All of us are going to die on 29th of June 2020. So we only have, I think it's something to do with the Isle of Man. I think the Isle of Man may be sinking into the sea on that day or something like that. So we only have 1 year left to do everything we've ever wanted to do in this life. We have 365 days to achieve our remaining ambitions, all the things in your bucket list, to do all these things. And also to live in the way that you've always wanted to live. What kind of relationship have you wanted to have to other people, to the world itself? So I want you to consider for a moment, what are you going to do with the last 365 days of your life? What kind of activities are you going to take up that you've never done before, that you've always wanted to? What kind of ambitions are you going to fulfill that you've never got around to? And how are you going to treat the people around you? Are you going to treat them the same way? Or does the knowledge that you only have a little bit of time left, does it change your attitude to those people? Or maybe there are people from the past that you'd like to make contact with, to make amends to, or just to make connection with again. So I'd like to ask you to think just for 2 minutes or so about what you're going to do with those 365 days. Think for a moment and then share some of the information with the person next to you. Just share a couple of the things that you're going to do in those last 12 months or 52 weeks of your life. So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to think about that and to talk about it to the people or the person next to you. Okay, so just another half a minute or so to finish that discussion. Okay, so let's, if you don't mind, let's wind that discussion to a close. Okay, but I'd like to hear about what you've talked about, what you've decided. Maybe somebody could tell me one of the things that they've decided they're going to do in the next year, the last year of your life. Yep. Pursuing a bigger purpose. Yeah. Doing something that really makes a difference. Something bigger than yourself. Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, pursuing a bigger purpose, doing something that really makes a significant difference to other people's lives, rather than just being immersed in everyday triviality. Sounds great. Yeah. Sounds great. Yeah, play with my boys more, spend more time with your kids, and really have lots of quality time, lots of attention. Sorry, what was that? You want to take your dad on holiday? Yeah? Yeah, you can put these things off forever, can't you? Yeah, so it's a good motivation to do them in the next few months. Okay, maybe one or two more. One more. Yep. No, sorry. No. That's not possible. It's been preordained. Sorry. Good question. Well, no, I think it's the whole world, actually. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, some great answers there. Well, I have actually got some good news, because we're not going to die on the 20th of June 2020. I've just heard it, but during the pause then it came through on my walkie-talkie. No, well, you never know, of course. You never know what's going to happen. But there's a good chance that we're not going to die. There's a very strong probability that we're all going to still be alive on the 29th of June 2020. But the idea of this exercise is that you should live your life as if it is the final year of your life. You should do all of the things you've mentioned. You should do them. Everything you've thought about, everything you've decided, you should follow those intentions and live your life as if it is really the final year of your existence. Yeah. I know. Well, you have to be sensible and practical. I did this once with my university students. They said, well, I'm just going to give up university. And I said, no. And then one of them said, well, I'm going to take lots of drugs and have sex with as many people as possible. I said, no. That's the wrong idea. So it kind of backfired. But no, but seriously, as long as you're sensible and practical, don't sell your house and give up your job. But you should do as many of those things as you can. You should live your life as if it is the final year of your life. There is actually a whole therapeutic program based on this. It's called A Year to Live. And people do spend the following year living exactly as they would if it was the final year of their life. So my exercise is based on that therapy. But the main thing is that we should live our lives with the awareness of our own mortality. We should remember that life is temporary. Life is fragile. Life is an amazing gift. which could be taken away from us at any moment. And the fact that life is so fragile and temporary makes it incredibly precious. And it makes the people around us incredibly precious, because everyone's life is temporary. Every relationship is temporary. So we owe it to the people around us, we owe it to life itself, to live with the awareness that life is temporary and fragile. And when we do that, life becomes much more fulfilling. Maybe you've had a little glimpse of that through the exercise, that life can become more fulfilling with that awareness of our own mortality. And coming back to the concept of psychological attachments, I think that is largely to do with psychological attachments, that when we face our own mortality, we give up the trivial things that we are attached to, like possessions, success, ambitions, and so on, resentment about the past. We let go of these things because they're no longer important. And that gives us a sense of freedom, a sense of liberation. So I'd like to lead you through a meditation, if that's okay. Would you like me to lead you through a meditation for 10 minutes or so? And it's based on what I've been talking about. It's based on releasing ourselves from our psychological attachments. And I'll end the meditation, just to give you some notice, I'll end it with a poem in the silence after the meditation. So, I will also sit down for this meditation. And it's a guided meditation which will hopefully release you from some of your psychological attachments. So first of all, let's sit in our favourite meditation posture, fairly alert but also relaxed. And when you're ready, let's close our eyes. And listen to the rain. And for a moment, just bring your attention to your breathing. Just feel the air as it enters and leaves your nose, brushing the inside of your nostrils as you breathe it in and out. Just feel that sensation of the air brushing your nose as you breathe in and out. And feel how your stomach rises and falls with your breath as you breathe in and out. And feel how with each breath, with each rising and falling of your stomach, you become a little more relaxed. You feel yourself relaxing as your breathing becomes deeper with each breath and slower. And I'd like you to picture an image in your mind. I'd like you to imagine yourself walking down a long, straight road that seems to stretch into the future. Stretching as far as you can see in front of you. There are maybe some scenes from your future by the side of the road as you walk towards them. And you see yourself walking along this road. And if you look behind you, you can see the road stretching behind you as well, into your past. You can see scenes from your past by the side of the road. It stretches as far as you can see behind you and in front of you. But as you walk along the road, way off in the distance now, you see a soft grey mist that arises and begins to cover the road as it foams towards you slowly. A soft grey mist covering the road, covering the events from your future by the side of the road, moving towards you slowly. As it moves towards you, it feels warm and welcoming, benevolent. You feel it touching your skin, over your whole body, and foaming inside your body, inside your legs, up to your waist, into your chest, into your shoulders and arms, up to your head. So the whole of your body is filled with this soft, foaming mist, making you feel even more relaxed. And the mist continues to foam behind you, covering the road behind you, covering the scenes from your past, until the whole of the road behind you and in front of you is covered by this mist, so that you no longer have a sense of the future or past. But slowly now, the mist begins to clear, and you can see sunlight beginning to break through as the mist disappears. Just like dawn breaking, the light beginning to seep through. And as the mist disappears, you can see a landscape being uncovered. A landscape of trees and fields and flowers, the sky above you, a blue sky above you. And all around you, you can see a panoramic natural landscape stretching in every direction, with no future and no past, the panorama of the present. So just allow yourself to survey that landscape in your mind. And as you survey the landscape, let go of any attachment to the future or the past. Remind yourself that the future is just an idea in your head based on anticipation. The past is just memories in your head and recordings of past events. The only real thing is the present moment, the panorama of the present all around you. So let go of any attachment to the future or the past. And now let's consider, as we allow the images to fade away from our mind, let's consider other aspects of our lives that we may be attached to. Let's consider any beliefs you have about the world, about life, about politics, about religion. And remind yourself that beliefs are just thoughts that have become hard and rigid. And allow yourself to let go of any beliefs you have. Let go of your attachment to any beliefs. Let's consider any possessions that you may be attached to, or any wealth or money that you may feel attached to. Remind yourself that in reality we can possess nothing. There are just objects that we use for a certain amount of time, that we put down again when we finish with them. But in reality, we own nothing. Maybe you can imagine that there's a kind of cord attaching you to possessions, to your possessions, a kind of ribbon or cord which attaches you to them. And just allow that cord to dissolve away so that you are no longer attached to these things. And let's consider any achievements or any kind of success or status you've built up in your life that makes you feel that you are an important person. And again, let's imagine that there's a kind of cord or ribbon that attaches you to your achievements or your sense of status. And allow that cord to fade away, or even you can cut that cord if you like. So allow yourself to become detached to these things, to these achievements and successes. And let's consider your appearance, how other people may define you in terms of the way you look, the way you may define yourself in terms of the way you look. But remember that the essence of your being has no appearance, it has no physical form. And allow yourself to let go of any attachment to your appearance or your physical form. Also consider the concept of age. How other people may define you in terms of your age, how you may think of yourself in terms of your age. But remember that age is just a concept. And the essence of your being has no age. It's timeless, just as it has no form. So allow yourself to let go of attachment to the concept of age. And finally, I want you to consider the concept of your name. Remember that your name is just a sound that was given you by your parents for ease of the communication. And the essence of your being has no name, just as it has no form and no age. So let go of attachment to your name. So at the end of this process of detachment, let's ask ourselves, what remains after we've let go of attachment to the future and the past, to our possessions, our beliefs, our status, our age and our form and our names? What remains at the end of this process? What remains is an energy and an awareness, which are the essence of your being. What remains is an energy that you can feel glowing inside you through your body, and an awareness of that energy. And within this essence of your being, you can feel a sense of wholeness and a sense of well-being. You can sense that this essence of your being exists in a natural state of wholeness and well-being that remains when everything else is taken away. So just for a few moments, let's rest within that feeling of wholeness and well-being. The essence of you is emptiness. The essence of you is love. The essence of you is energy. The essence of you is bliss. The essence of you is deathless. This form will wither and dissolve away, and the essence will return to its source to find a new expression. The essence of you stretches inside and outside your body, inside and outside time, within and beyond the world, at home, in peace, in every place. And now let's slowly return our attention to this room, to the sounds around you in this room, to the body, your body sitting on the chair, your feet on the ground in front of you. Let's slowly open our eyes again. So what I was trying to illustrate there was the process of letting go of psychological attachments and how it can enable us to make contact with a deep source of well-being inside us. And when we make contact with that part of us, we realize that we don't actually need any external things. We don't need possessions. We don't need status or success. We just need to make contact with that part of us, that feeling of wholeness and well-being, which is deep inside us, but often covered over with our psychological attachments. Thank you very much.